Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the PM Prepcast, simply the best way to prepare for your PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. Today's lesson is an overview of the Project Scope Management knowledge area. It's a group of processes required to ensure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required to complete your project. We'll look at why we have it and what we do and the concepts that you must know for the PMP exam. In this lesson, we compare project scope and product scope, discuss how to plan scope management, collect requirements and define scope, talk about the work breakdown structure and the related WBS Dictionary, look at what's included in the scope baseline, discuss scope creep and explain its effects on your project, and we'll review validating and controlling scope. We begin at the very top by starting out with the concept behind the project scope management knowledge area and then work our way down towards the processes. The official definition for project scope management is project scope management includes the processes required to ensure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required to complete the project successfully. And to help us do that, the PMBOK guide offers 6 processes. As with so many other knowledge area, it starts out with a planning process called Plan Scope Management. This is the process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. From here we move on to collect requirements. This is the process of determining and documenting and managing stakeholder needs and requirements to meet project objectives. Once we have that, we can then go ahead and we can define scope. That's the process of developing a detailed description of the project and product. Now that we have the scope in a detailed level, we are going to have to create a WBS, a work breakdown structure, in the process of subdividing project deliverables and project work into smaller, more manageable components. We also have to validate the scope. This is the process of formalizing acceptance of the completed project deliverables. This is where your customer says, yes, this is great, I like it, this is approved. And of course, as you may probably be aware, scope tends to change in a project. So we have to control scope in the process of monitoring the status of the project and product scope and managing changes to our scope baseline. So we have 6 processes, but we only have 5 process groups defined in the PMBOK guide. Where do they fall? Well, it's really usually quite simple with the first one, plan scope management. Of course, this falls into planning. Then it gets interesting because collect requirements, define scope, and create WBS, they're all in the same process. But think about it. You've done initiating because you've just planned it, but you're not really executing anything here yet. So collect requirements, define scope, and create WBS are also planning processes. You prepare a work breakdown structure. You're still defining your scope. You're going out to your project stakeholders and collect their requirements. You gather information, you plan. How are we going to build all of this? Then you do something very interesting. You hand what you have off to the executing processes, which are not part of this knowledge area. Execution of the development of the scope is done elsewhere. But we still have to make sure that the scope is validated and approved, that is, monitoring and controlling, and of course, control scope at the very end. There's also a dead giveaway in the name with control. That is also part of the monitoring and controlling process group. So, 4 out of our 6 processes are planning processes, 2 monitoring and controlling. In one of our many other lessons, we talked about the difference between the product life cycle and the project life cycle. And here in scope, we have a very similar situation because we have the product scope and we also have the project scope. The product scope is defined as the features and functions that characterize a product, service, or result. The project scope, on the other hand, is defined as the work that must be performed to deliver a product, service, or result with the specific features and functions. It is the description of the work required to deliver the product. It defines what work will and will not be included. The project scope also guides the project manager on decisions to add, change, or remove work from the project. Its primary concern is with defining and controlling what is and what is not included in the project. There is also a difference in how your performance is measured in regards to these 2 scopes. The product scope is measured against the product requirements, and you will measure if the product is according to the product specifications. The project scope, on the other hand, is measured against the work that is defined in the project management plan. In particular, the scope baseline, which consists of the project scope statement and the WBS and the WBS Dictionary. These are important distinctions to keep in mind when you are working on sample questions that discuss the product or the project scope. In the next few minutes, we are going to take a look at a few key terms from project scope management that you'll need to know for the exam. And of course, we look at these again in the detailed lessons for the individual processes. First, here's the term scope that you already see on the screen. Yes, we have talked about nothing but the scope so far. But just for completeness' sake, let's review the official definition of scope together. It is the sum of the products, services and results to be provided as a project. The first step in developing scope is to establish a plan. The importance of the planning process is that it will guide how we manage scope throughout the project. Planned scope management involves the process of creating a scope management plan, of establishing also a requirements management plan, and it also documents how the project scope is defined, once it is developed, how it is validated, and ultimately how we stop it from completely spiraling out of control. After we create a plan on how we will manage the scope, we must now determine what the objectives are of the project. Collect requirements ensures that we understand why we undertake this project and how success is defined. In collect requirements, we must first identify and determine the needs and the requirements for the product, service, or the result specified by the client. We must also quantify and document the needs and expectations of the sponsor, customer, and other stakeholders. The requirements, they will then become the foundation for creating the work breakdown structure, as well as the cost, schedule, quality, and procurement planning. And they should be identified in enough detail so that we can include these in the scope baseline. The defined scope process focuses on describing your scope and also describing what is not part of your scope. When we're defining the scope, we will end up with a detailed description of our project and of our product. The output from the defined scope process is a scope statement, which includes a product scope description, acceptance criteria, deliverables, project exclusions, constraints, and also assumptions. The process of defined scope is highly iterative, and it may occur again and again over the life cycle of a project. And this is because of the detailed nature of our scope. We have to delve deeper and deeper into it. So this process may need to be revisited as work is progressing on the project. Once we have our scope defined, we want to create a WBS, a work breakdown structure, and this here is the definition from the PMBOK guide. It is a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. And of course, the two key words from this definition here are decomposition and hierarchical. So, as we break down the scope of work, we decompose it into more manageable packages of work. Well, they're called actually work packages. And the relationship between each of these work packages and the whole project is to be structured in a hierarchy where we will go from less detail at the top to more and more detail towards the bottom. Let's take a look at an example of a work breakdown structure and how it is structured by building an airplane. All right? We begin at level 0, at the very top. This usually just identifies the project. And then, of course, below that, you have the first level where you start breaking things into the major components of your project, or in this particular case here, of the product that we are building. And you now begin to break it down even further. Below that, you're going to take the body of your airplane, you're going to break it up into the cockpit, the passenger cabin, and the freight cabin. Each of these components that you see here, they're called work breakdown structure components. And we now have to go even further down because, as I said earlier, we will decompose our scope to such detail that we can then assign it to someone so that they can actually work on that particular package. For instance, I cannot tell a single person, here you go, work on the passenger cabin. I have to break that down even further. And this item that is at the very lowest level, this is then called the work package. As you can see, it is at the lowest level of the work breakdown structure. We have highlighted them in green to show the difference between the blue work breakdown structure components and the green work packages, which can be assigned to somebody to work on and complete. The work breakdown structure, the WBS, is one of the most important tools on your project. It's the primary output of the Create WBS process, and it becomes part of our scope baseline. And this scope baseline will later on then be used for defining project activities, for estimating the cost, for determining your project budget. We'll use it for quality planning, identifying risks, and also planning our procurement, for instance. And because the WBS is such an important part of the scope baseline with all these things here resulting from it, many companies have WBS templates that you can use. Usually your PMO will provide that. If you don't have a PMO, you can also use the WBS from a past project as a template, as long, of course, as this past project is similar to the one that you're executing right now. The details of what exactly needs to be done in order to deliver the result of a work package, they're not described in the WBS. Instead, work packages are described in detail in the WBS Dictionary. So, for example, the WBS Dictionary describes for each work package who this work package is assigned to. If there are any target delivery milestones, you'll find those in here as well. It includes the technical information about the work package, and of course it will also include a detailed description of the work that needs to be performed as part of the work package. So if you're assigned to build the carpet for the airplane, you will find all the information about this carpet described in the WBS Dictionary. Here's a final thought, a final note on the WBS. Please tell me, how big is a work package at the very bottom of your WBS? How far down do you decompose your scope? When do you stop? When do you know that you can stop and assign it to your resource? Well, the answer is that you can stop when you have reached a level at which the work package is detailed enough to estimate and execute and also monitor and control it during project execution. The more general rule of thumb here is that no work package should be less than 8 hours or more than 80 hours of work for the person or group to whom this is going to be assigned to for completion. Let's come back to a term I used a few moments ago, the scope baseline. Whenever there is a change made to the scope, this change will first be analyzed against the scope baseline. But what is the scope baseline? Well, it's quite simple. The scope baseline consists of 3 documents. First of all, your project scope statement. Then the WBS, the work breakdown structure, as well as the work breakdown structure dictionary. And I promise that once you have watched all the lessons here on scope, you will know the ins and outs of the scope baseline and all the other terms that we have looked at so far in this lesson. So what would happen if there were no scope control at all? What if anyone could change the scope on your project pretty much at the drop of a hat? Well, you would end up with scope creep. Scope creep happens and impacts your project if you add features and functionality to the scope without addressing the effects that this change has on the other project constraints like time, cost, quality, resources, you name it. And this here is the most important bit. If you do not get formal approval. So the best way to avoid scope creep is by having a clearly defined scope and by implementing a change control system. Such a system will define the administrative requirements and processes you need to go through in order to have changes to the scope implemented. It tells you how changes are documented and how they are tracked. It defines what type of approval levels are required. Plus, most change control systems are often integrated into the overall project management information system, the PMIS, so that you have everything in one place. But don't think of the PMIS as just software. Such a system can simply consist of your company having formally documented policies and procedures that describe what you have to do, and then you do it manually on paper without software support. Let's also briefly look at the term scope change. If something needs to change, well, we simply call this a scope change. And this is really any change to the project scope. And since the scope is one of the many competing project constraints that we have, a scope change usually also leads to an update of at least 2 other constraints. So go ahead and guess which other 2 constraints will probably need to be changed when you make a scope change. Think back to your own projects. The customer comes to you and says, I need to add scope. I want more than I had previously. What is going to change? Quite clearly, cost. It's going to cost more because we've just added more to the project that needs to be delivered. And because we're adding more, it's going to take us longer. The schedule is going to be changed as well, the time. And by the way, this also works the other way around as well. A schedule change usually requires an update to scope, and cost change normally requires an update to cost and schedule. But remember, there are a great number of competing constraints, and they're all connected. Scope, cost, and schedule are simply those that have the strongest and best understood interactions. And this concludes our overview of project scope management. But before we go, here is an exam tip for you, because many sample questions that you will see may contain unnecessary information. They are 2 paragraphs long and they describe some scenario, very long-winded. But in the end, this scenario is really not the key focus of the question. You'll very likely find similar questions on the actual exam as well. Another type of question, the long-winded question, tests if you are able to focus on the really important facts of this particular project scenario, and if you can ignore all of the noise that is also given to you as part of that scenario. Therefore, it's really important that you focus on reading and understanding each question. Make sure that you understand what the real question is. Then you'll be able to tune out all this necessary information in the question. Simple trick is usually when you see a very long exam question, read the last sentence, because the last sentence is usually where the real question resides. And for now, we have reached the end of this lesson. So Justine says,
I'm out of here.
and of course it's until next time from me.